Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. You talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And you'd think with my background, I would be an easier sell on a lot of nerdier music, art, and culture. Because you know what? I do describe myself as a nerd, at least in the stereotypical sense. I own and have read hundreds of fantasy and sci-fi novels. I've been playing video games and tabletop role-playing games for decades. I regularly go to nerd conventions. I still play Magic the Gathering. I mean, for God's sake, I got a small collection of swords. One of them's in frame. It's mounted on my wall. Even my educational background outside of my career, both on and offline, it's in physics, which thanks to the ubiquity of the Big Bang Theory has been branded as the nerdiest of the scientific disciplines, at least in popular culture. It's really not. That's pure math. And thus, you would think that the nerdy art would be an easy sell for me on relatability alone? But most of the time it just doesn't really click, and I've struggled to pin down exactly why. Well, okay, on some level it has to do with the fact that just common points of reference don't win me over automatically. It'd be nice if people actually said something with said points of reference rather than just use them for a cheap pop. No, the larger and more troublesome issues, they might come with the fact that the whole outcast but ahead of the curve veneer of nerdy spaces is often just that. A veneer, and more often than not, it would reflect many of the same cultural values as non-nerds do, just with an increased lack of social skills, and really, that strikes me as a lot of missed potential. And that's not even getting to how certain nerds have made the concentrated effort to rewrite history and erase the forward-thinking progressive values that did bubble forth on some intellectual spaces that were outside the mainstream, especially if those nerds didn't fit a very specific caricature or demographic like myself. And that takes us to underground hip-hop. Now, we already saw last time with Company Flow and LP that even though all those guys were plainly nerds and kind of proud of it, it wasn't like they were immune to trends in hip-hop and larger culture at the time. And so when I started digging into the debut of Jedi Mind Tricks, a Philadelphia-based group who released their debut album that same year in 1997, and a lot of their content was being framed as forward-thinking and progressive, and also emphasized points of reference in astronomy, sci-fi, physics, history, religion, cranking up all that nerd cred. Alright, look, I'll admit I was curious. But, okay, this won the popular vote very comfortably on Patreon. So today, we're going to be talking about the psychosocial, chemical, biological, and electromagnetic manipulation of the human consciousness, which I'm just going to call the Psychosocial CD for short, by Jedi Mind Tricks, and this is Resonators. So alright, just a quick disclaimer before going forward. While this album was much easier to get a hold of properly than Fun Crusher Plus, I do have to stress that I'm going to be covering the original 12-song release from 1997, not the mass-marketed reissue bundle from 2001 or 2003. It's tough to tell where it's coming from. That tacks on 6 more songs that have been recorded years earlier. Just want to keep this as streamlined as possible, and those 6 tracks had been originally recorded a few years before the sessions of this album. It should also be noted that a couple of the tracks, both in the original and the reissue, were included on the 1996 EP Amber Probe, and indeed the song Neva Antiquated included on this project is the Dark Jedi remix. Just so we're all on the same page with getting reviewed here, especially as the original vinyl did not receive much circulation outside of a very small underground community. And with that being said, we encounter another conundrum. One that I brought up when I reviewed Fun Crusher Plus, in that the ideas and language that presented on a project like this, they might not feel as innovative now as they were at the time. Hell, listening to this and then revisiting the newest project from Eugen Blackrock this year, I can totally see the roots of this kind of esoteric writing going back to Jedi Mind Tricks in the first place, and I absolutely respect that. But what's always kind of concerned me about this sort of retrospective look back is that I wouldn't find the distinctive elements that can make a project like this stand out, even against what would come later in the underground. I mean, it might have been striking at the time, but now I've heard so much of what its influence. And while that didn't wind up being the case for Fun Crusher Plus, it's great both then and now. It might be an issue for the Psychosocial CD, and it's actually pretty easy to pinpoint why. Because for as intricate and layered as the group's points of reference are, they don't really seem to add up to as much as they really could beyond highlighting their transcendence as rappers and how many intricate ways they're going to destroy their rivals. And sure, there's some real flair to some of that on a purely poetic level, especially if you grasp those points of reference. But once I feel you get the whole pseudo-apocalyptic iconography, not only does certain symbolism cribbed from Revelation or Eastern philosophy start repeating itself, but there's a squandered opportunity to not tell more of a story or get deeper into some of the high concept ideas represented by these symbols and metaphors. Now, I guess when you're setting the template early on, it might make sense to stick with the basics. And for many first-time listeners who don't have a background in symbology or literature or sci-fi or religious texts, it could read as saying a lot more than it is, and I'll admit I'm coming in with a lot more expertise, and again, I've heard a lot of this passed down through generations of hip-hop, but there is still an odd weightlessness as this project continues, because without more of that deeper human connection to some of these stories to pull an emotional core into the work, or a more developed theme to tie it all together, it just doesn't quite hit with as much potency for me, especially when it's the wordplay and iconography that's absolutely the central attraction on display. And that's not counting the points where the references just don't seem to make a lot of sense. Go to Neva Antiquated and we get the whole line 121 gigawatts to defeat me like Marty McFly. But that's the wattage he needed in the DeLorean to get home, not defeat him. Or go to As It Was in the Beginning, where we get lines like, I am torture like the fear of internationalism, Nazi eugenics, and economic rationalism. Okay, maybe not the best idea to compare yourself to the Nazis, or economic theory is mostly discredited even at the time of this album's release. Now, alright, to be fair, there are a couple points where they are talking about some more than just their skills as MCs and crushing other rappers. We got songs like Books of Blood, The Coming of Tan, which espouses a lot of the whole ancient astronaut theory that religious figures were either aliens or seated among our population to control us. Probably not the best idea to spend so much of this album then drawing comparisons to yourselves through that, and then following up with the theory that AIDS was created by the G7 countries in the 60s to devastate Africa. And you called the Freemasons crazy on the Immaculate Conception. But you know what? On the flip side, I really do like how the album ends. First with the Apostles' Creed, which slowly begins to drag things back to earth and highlight the lonely road carved by lyrical artifice and wild creativity. And then I Who Have Nothing, where the frontman Vinnie Paz describes how he suffers through depersonalization disorder. And you know what? I'll admit having this context absolutely does provide clarity to a few main points across the album. The first being the whole verbal hologram running motif, where his rapping produces an artistic projection to speak away from himself, and the second providing some real weight to the depression and more of the apocalyptic darkness that courses through the entire record. And you know what? It's kind of a shame we only get flickering snapshots of more of this personal story across the album. I kind of don't like that we have to wait till the end, or that the final song cuts off so abruptly before we hear more, or that most of the guest stars seem more interested in the whole esoteric quasi-spiritual imagery for its own sake, or just not nearly as impressive behind the microphone. Now, I'll admit that the Breath of Judah's delivery is distinctive, but his lisping and slippery hold on the beat did kind of get irritating for me. But for as forceful as Apathy could be, I like all three of his verses here. It was hard to avoid the feeling that his blunter style might be a better fit for a style and production that felt a little bit more conventional, or at least a little bit more straightforward boom bap. Now, I will say that I really dug whenever Sun Pharaoh showed up. His rhymes felt a little bit more carefully constructed, and it's kind of a shame I can't find any evidence he ever put out any more material. Similar case for Yan the Phenomenon. I really liked his tangled but raw verse on the Apostles' Creed, and yet outside of a few other scattered appearances, mostly linked to Jedi mind tricks, it never looks like we got a full project from him, and that's kind of a shame. But alright, that's just the lyricism. And while it's easily the biggest highlight and why anybody would come to this, the production really is the other half of the story, and I honestly wish I liked it more. Now, granted, when your comparison points are producers like LP, who would come to push the sounds of the genre by leaps and bounds, it's kinda not even fair, but I will say that while the dusty sample touch boom bap that Stoop serves up, it's pretty damn melodic and eerie, there are a fair few tonal choices and blends that I wish I liked a lot more than I do. The grainy, wailing shrieks of the strings and the sample blend on the hook of the Winds of War, the warping, oily acoustics around Omnicron, and the faint, borderline chipmunk coo behind the Immaculate Conception. I mean, even if I really do like the thicker touches of atmosphere around the song, tonally it just doesn't click as much as I wanted. And then you got Chinese water torture. I mean, between the slightly tinny drum pickup against the very on-the-nose drippy tone, I mean, I can appreciate the intricacies and the layering of the composition, but they might have succeeded a little bit too well in capturing that vibe. It just doesn't really click. Now, on the flip side, I really did like the crackling thunder behind the bleak pianos driving Neva antiquated, the ramshackle guitars behind the Apostles' Creed, and the fragmented elegance behind the sample, the blast of horns, and the strings arrangement on I You Have Nothing. To opt for maybe a little bit more urgency on that song, it might not have been the choice I was expecting given the subject matter, but it definitely fits what Vinnie Paz is going, and honestly, it might be a little bit abrupt how it ends, but I really like it. But as a whole, I want to be careful with my words here because while I can absolutely see the influence of this album across underground hip-hop, even to this day, I would struggle to call it a personal favorite of mine. Even if I can definitely see in some circles why it is considered a classic and how it started off so many other different branches within underground hip-hop. The content and the bars for me, they only start to seriously coalesce near the end. And while I can appreciate how just using this style of lyricism and wordplay would place them outside the mainstream in 97, and yet make them foundational for so many acts to come, you can also tell that the group hadn't quite tapped into the potential of their content to deliver emotionally compelling greatness, at least not yet. I will say I was pleased to hear little of the shock value content that I had heard saturated much of their critically acclaimed sophomore follow-up, which paradoxically means this album might have actually wound up aging better. We'll see if I cover that sophomore album. But going back to my issues with nerdy music, I definitely feel a similar distance with this album here too, where the layered reference points, I do recognize them, I appreciate the kinship that comes with knowing them, but the insight isn't quite as developed as it should be. As such, for me, it's a very solid 7 out of 10, but I absolutely recommend it if only to provide the historical context for so many acts that would follow. And you know what? For these sort of Jedi mind tricks, worth your time. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. This was a bit of a complicated one. I kind of expected it would be. Jedi Mind Tricks is a complicated act, and they got kind of a lot of the swirling, tangled imagery. I can imagine there'll be people who pick up a lot more out of this just on poetry alone than I did. And I can respect that. It just didn't really get there for me. But hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below. And I got the poll up there for y'all. Tell me how wrong I am. Looking forward to it. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you want to support the channel, link to my Patreon right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.